Okay, so today we're going to have an introduction to cosmological arguments, which are another kind of argument from observation for the existence of God. Now, the key idea with cosmological arguments, as opposed to, say, teleological arguments, is that whilst it's based upon observation, it's not based upon an observation of a kind of a small thing that has an indication of design. Rather, it's based upon the kind of general appearance or general rules uh, of the universe. So, whilst the whilst the teleological arguments tend to use science a lot more, cosmological arguments tend to rely much more heavily upon logic and reasoning. In that way, they're much more philosophical. Now, I thought it would be best just to start with an example to see what we're talking about. So an example is the Kalam cosmological argument, which is an adaptation of an Islamic cosmological argument presented by William Lane Craig. The argument goes like this. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. So, for instance, this chair began to exist, and the cause of the chair were tools and wood. The universe began to exist. Here the universe is, and my attempt at drawing the Big Bang, right? Now, if everything that begins to exist as a cause and the universe began to exist, the conclusion of this argument of premise 1, premise 2, of course, is that the universe has a cause. God is the typical thing that they say. Now, that's an example. Before we examine some of the key cosmological arguments, I just want to start by defining a whole load of things. Like a whole load of things. Let's start here with the distinction between necessity on the one hand and contingency on the other. So a thing exists contingently if it could not exist. Okay. Now, actually, Aquinas tends to have a slightly more old-fashioned view of this, and he thinks that it tends towards non-existence. But the basic idea is a contingent thing is something that could have not been or could stop being. You and I are examples of contingent things. In fact, every physical thing you can think of is a contingent thing. Well, what's a necessary thing then? Well, a necessary thing is something that must exist. Or another way of putting that, cannot not exist. There is no possibility of it not existing. And that is supporters of the cosmological argument's view of God. Okay, so that's the difference between necessity and contingency. A contingent thing comes into existence, leaves existence again, it could not exist. A necessary thing always exists. It cannot not exist. The next term I want to talk about is infinity. Now, infinity is something that cosmological arguments often try to deny. And an infinite thing is kind of a set of numbers that goes on forever. Now, in kind of more modern cosmological arguments like Craig's Kalam, there are distinctions between different kinds of infinites. But in Aquinas' cosmological arguments, we've got a much simpler understanding of infinity. It's just a set of numbers that goes on forever, or a set of events that has no end. Okay. Finally, I just want to define deductive and a posteriori. Just very quickly, this is the big difference, right, between one of the big differences between most cosmological arguments and all teleological arguments is that it's deductive instead of inductive. Remember, inductive is a probabilistic argument. A deductive argument is where the premises necessitate the conclusion. So they make the conclusion true. All right, conk, because I haven't got space. I apologize. In other words, if the premises are correct and the logic works, then the conclusion must be true. And finally, a posteriori. Well, a posteriori, you know that, right? It means that the premises are drawn from experience. Okay. So those are the main definitions. I'm aware we spent a while going over those definitions. Shall we look at some cosmological arguments? Yeah, let's look at some cosmological arguments. I'll tell you what, I'll fill up the rest of your screen. Here we are. So, St. Thomas Aquinas is the name most associated with cosmological arguments. And Aquinas, in his book, the Summa Theologica, has 5 arguments for the existence of God. The first 3 of which, don't worry, that wasn't a typo, the first 3 of which are cosmological arguments. So I want to just briefly introduce you to these now. We've got tutorials on the others, so just use this to get an idea of what they're about. The first way is the argument from motion. Now, motion here means change, changing from one state to another. So we might start with the idea that there is motion. So there is, I'm going to write, shall I write change? I'll write change. You know that change is motion, right? Same thing, there is change. Okay. You can see that all around you. All of the time, things are constantly changing. Tea is going from hot to cold. Wood is going from not on fire to on fire, and so on, right? Change, he thinks, must be caused. Okay, so there must be a cause for the change. Now, that there is change, that's the general rule we've got. Change must be caused. This is quite a standard thing because, of course, if change must be caused, we get this is going to be hard to say, a chain of change, or a change of motion, a chain of motion. I was trying to say chain of motion there, and I got change of motion. That's not a thing. So if there is change, and change must be caused by something else, there must be a chain. A chain of motion. Of change. But because infinites don't exist, no infinites. He thinks infinites are impossible. That chain must stop somewhere. There must be a first cause of the change, let's go back to motion, a first mover. And this, he thinks, of course, is God. That's the argument from motion. The argument next is the argument from efficient cause, and it's very similar to the argument from motion. So efficient cause, though, is not about one thing changing from one state to another, like wood going from wood to wood that's on fire. It's rather about things coming into existence. An efficient cause is the thing that causes something to be. Okay? So there are causes. I'm going to write causes rather than efficient causes because, well, space, time, there's so many reasons. There are causes. Of course, those things must also be caused. So if there are causes and those things must be caused, well, you've got, you guessed it, a chain, right? You've got a chain of causes. And just like with the first argument, that chain can't go on forever. It can't be infinite. And so there must be a first cause. Okay, can you guess who Aquinas thought that first cause was? Correct. God. And this, he says, is what we call God. Remember, he's writing in the 13th century, so he's writing for a very religious audience anyway. So saying, I'm going to give that first cause the label God is reasonable at the time. Is a being that you already think probably exists. Here's more proof. That's what he would have been read as at the time. Finally, so we've got motion, we've got efficient cause. Finally, and relatively briefly, we've got contingency and necessity, which doesn't look the same as the first two. These first two, very, very, very similar, right? But with different kind of general rules. This third one looks quite different. Remember contingency and necessity. A contingent thing is something that kind of tends not to exist in Aquinas' terminology, whereas a necessary thing is a thing that cannot not exist. The universe is full of contingent things. But given enough time, and the universe is definitely very old, at some point, if there were contingent things, there would have been nothing. If you have enough time and things tend to come in and out of existence, you can imagine a point at which there would be nothing in existence. So there'd be nothing at some point. But nothing, you see, nothing comes from nothing. So there must always have been, there has to have been something to bring everything else into existence. And what could that something be but a necessary thing, a thing that cannot not exist, because contingent things are already ruled out, right? They are excluded because at that point there would have been nothing. So there must be a necessary thing. And of course, that necessary thing, says Aquinas, is what we call God. So there are Aquinas' three ways, three versions of cosmological argument. Cosmological argument based on general rules for the existence of God.